This video is indeed rated B for you'd better back on out of here if you don't want spoilers, buddy. Within Dawntrail's main story, a character is revealed to us that had been around since the very beginning, silently biding his time and enjoying the fruitful ignorance of those that he saw as inconsequential. Some might wonder why Calyx didn't reveal himself sooner, or immediately intervene the moment things didn't go his way. But by the time things had progressed to the point that he felt like he would need to interfere, events had already stretched well beyond the breaking point, and he was far, far too late. But today, my friends, we will not be simply covering the downfall of Dawntrail's surprise villain, but how his failures helped to expose that he himself was never as prescient as he declares himself to be. Knowledge is powerful, to be sure, but it is ultimately a tool, and even the greatest tools become useless without a steady hand to hold them. Calyx was knowledgeable, no doubt, but without the twin hands of perspective and reason to wield them, knowledge had blinded him to the tragedy that not only saw to his defeat, but still hangs heavy over his head. And the fear he once thought to expunge from his life had not only remained, it had grown so strong that he might very well have doomed himself and others like him to complete and utter oblivion. Gather around, my friends, for today we'll be discussing the life and actions of Calyx and how he may have bestowed upon himself a fate worse than death. Calyx was a boy born to the Ninth Reflection. Being a post-sundering world meant that the Ninth only had about 1/14 of the star's original etheric power and/or density. And ether is everything, from material resources, water, air, and even life itself. Things upon the source and its reflections are all products of ether in some way. How much and to what concentration might change, but the importance of this all-encompassing energy remains the same. The Ninth Reflection never had as much raw power and potential as the source, which at this point in Dawntrail's story was now 7 times rejoined, the world having regained about 4/7 its original power, which is a little more than half the star's original etheric potential. Exactly how many different civilizations upon the Ninth had existed and to what extent is not entirely clear as of the time of this lecture, because while we can chronologically determine the changing of time upon the source with some degree of accuracy by marking every age with the arrival of an umbral calamity and astral era, most reflections are under some form of temporal dilation, meaning that time may be moving faster or slower than the source at any given moment. It's entirely likely that the only people that knew for certain how life and time was progressing upon every reflection were the Ascians. But that's something we'll return to later. Know that, for now, most of the history and achievements of the Ninth Reflection are entirely unknown, as is the current state of the reflection itself. But Calyx would be born into this world of sundered souls to a frail and weak body. The exact details of his condition aren't well known, but suffice to say, he wasn't long for this world. His body would eventually fail him long before reaching half of what would be considered a normal lifespan. Many people would quail at such an unfortunate fate, and perhaps live out what life they did have as honestly and as happily as they could before their time came. But Calyx wasn't an average person. Perhaps it was due to his upbringing or even the nature of his very soul, but Calyx would be possessed of a remarkably high intellect when compared to most others upon the Ninth Reflection. And it was he who pioneered most of Alexandria's rapid technological advancement with the aid of electrope. And yet, Calyx did not invent Electrope, as that achievement belongs to the Lalafell that had fled from the source to the Ninth during the Calamity of Ice. They had used a magical relic's mysterious powers to open a portal that would see them safely to the Ninth Reflection, and avoiding a potentially frozen fate. Unfortunately, this appeared to be a one-way trip, as after they arrived, they were never able to rouse the relic to activate its unique powers again. But these Lalafell did not collapse under pressure. Instead, they took complete advantage of their superior arcane research to stand out, especially among the civilizations of this reflection. Their use of arc anima and its structured manipulation of etheric power meant that, even trapped as they were upon a weaker reflection, meant that these Lalafell were able to find new ways to make use of what little ether this world had when compared to the source. This would eventually lead to the creation of Electrope, as these Lalafell discovered that by carving unique symbols and arcane circuitry upon certain minerals, they were able to turn even modest stones into conduits for tremendous power and spells. Indeed, if it wasn't for these Lalafell having migrated from the source, it's extremely likely that Electrope not only wouldn't exist upon the Ninth, it may very well have never been invented. Because even upon the source, the Lalafell's understanding of arcane geometry is quite unique. It isn't incorrect to say that the greatest discovery upon the Ninth Reflection did not belong to them. It would be thanks to the ingenuity of Calyx that Electrope would not only be adapted quickly to different facets of Alexandrian society, but it would soon be applied to things that those descended from the Lalafell upon the source might never have considered. And likely with good reason, as Calyx would eventually use the technological advancement provided by Electrope to create what would be known as the Endless, which are memory-based simulations of existing or deceased individuals. It can easily be assumed that the entire reason Calyx devoted much of his time and research into the Endless was not really to save or advance Alexandria, but was to save himself. As stated before, Calyx was born sickly, an unfortunate life to be burdened with, to be sure, but that's how it goes. Life is rarely fair, and while even a healthy hero can live anywhere between 70 to 100 years of age, some races live even longer than that. As to live means that one day something must be able to die. But Calyx would attempt to use his cold and calculating mind to try to subvert his untimely end. Through the innovation of Electrope and research into the Endless, he believed it was possible to not just avoid death once, but forever, as an Endless would have no body to wither and decay in the first place. And while this may sound like a novel idea to the uninitiated, it would appear that, in his desperation, he was prepared to make concessions that many researchers and philosophers would likely never allow. While he puts on a distant and unfeeling front, deep down, Calyx is a very frightful individual, and in his fear of death, he bestowed upon himself an even worse fate. Throughout the story of Dawntrail, Calyx more than once refers to entities like the Endless as the next stage of mankind's evolution, which would be very odd to hear for anyone well-versed in Final Fantasy XIV's lore, or at least has an understanding of the setting's use of ether. So for any new to this channel or Final Fantasy XIV lore in general, allow me to briefly explain. Life, or rather an average naturally occurring life upon the source or its reflections, are primarily composed of two things. Material ether, which makes up their body, biology, as well as everything physical, and their soul, which is the raw magical force of will and power provided by the star itself, both a physical and metaphysical force working in tandem to create what we see as an individual. The soul provides etheric power, similar to how a battery might charge a device. while the physical body provides both form and function. A body that suddenly loses its soul will eventually perish, as the life-giving ether of their spirit is now gone. Much like how the bodies belonging to the Scions of the Seventh Dawn would have perished during the events of Shadowbringers if not for the aid of people like Kryl. Her ministrations meant that their bodies would survive at least a little bit longer, while their souls were pulled away to the First. However, the opposite is also true. A spirit without a body is closer to that of a ghost or a phantom, as the only energy making up their physical form is now the naturally expelling energy of their soul. But while these two things help to make up a living thing, it's important to note that as something lives, they are passively generating a third type of ether: memory. Memories are indeed a unique form of magical phenomena, but memories are finicky. The cutscenes within Old Charlian explained it best when comparing memories to ink one might scribe upon the surface of something. These memories can be written upon your soul, your body, or even contained within something like a soul crystal. So long as memories have something to be written onto, they will persist. And that's the catch. Memories cannot exist or be created on their own. They must be written upon or contained by something, otherwise they disappear like smoke into the wind. And just because someone has memories of something doesn't necessarily mean they remember it clearly or correctly. As, unlike the other two forms of ether, memories are not absolute. This is why memory is often seen as the weakest and most inconsistent of these three etheric forms. Our memories may be important to us, but that's all. They're only important to us. The universe of Final Fantasy XIV does not treat memories as sacred. In fact, once a person naturally passes on, their memories will eventually be expunged as their soul returns to the heart of the star. No matter how good or bad a life was, their spirit will most likely lose all of the accumulated memories of their past life, becoming a blank slate yet again before they're born into the world at a later date, in a cycle known as reincarnation. So with all that in mind, it's odd to hear someone as supposedly intelligent as Calyx try and prescribe memories alone as the next stage of evolution, when anyone with even a rough understanding of etherology knows that memory alone is not nearly enough. This isn't evolution, it's a dead end. Fear is defined as an emotional response generated to inform us of when we're in immediate or eventual peril. Like most things, fear can be useful, a subtle intuition warning us of when something isn't quite right, and giving us a moment to prepare or at least become more alert. But fear can also be a burden, as some eventually become ruled by fear. It's all they can think of, and they will do anything to try to free themselves of it. This is how fear can become hysteria, and at that point, a person is rarely thinking logically. So focused on fixing or escaping that one thing that they become blind to all other dangers they are possibly stepping into. I would assert to you that Calyx is one such person. While his sickly body and short life were unfortunate, it would appear that this situation caused him to be ruled by the fear of death for most of his life. Despite his intellect, his accomplishments, and even after getting the endless form he wanted, he never quite stopped being afraid. Calyx is an individual ruled by fear, and that fear took two forms: his never-ending desire for control and his appearance. As an endless, the Calyx we see is more of a projection than a real thing, because whatever matrix is holding his memories and experiences is now his true body, as that is what his memories have been scribed onto. So, as a raw projection of memories that could take just about any form he desires, why choose to remain like this? The Calyx we see takes the form of both researcher and ward, doctor and patient, as if he is both sickly, yes, but also does not trust anyone but himself to oversee his own treatment. His eyes are dark with either fatigue or anxiety. His skin and hair are both pale, giving him an almost corpse-like appearance. But one of the most intriguing features is the device sticking out of his neck. It can be assumed that this is in fact a CVC, or Central Venous Catheter, possibly something that he had for most of his life given his weak constitution, which is very interesting. For someone who sees himself as having evolved beyond death and his once weak mortal life, it would seem that even now, it's all he can think about, even all these years later. Despite his boasting, bragging, and condescending remarks, his chosen appearance would suggest that he never stopped being that scared and sickly child who was always one bad day away from meeting his end. If Calyx was as ascendant as he claims to be, why would he choose an appearance that constantly reminds him of the time in his life when he was at his most afraid? One could argue that it's to remind himself why he does what he does, but I would go so far as to assert that it's because he never grew beyond his mortal life. He's still afraid, and due to being an endless, he has every right to be. As stated earlier, memories are neither a driving force for life or able to exist without a form to hold them. They require some form of catalyst or platform. Upon death, they are among the first things to go as their souls enter into what might be considered the afterlife, with only the most traumatizing or inspiring feelings being left upon their soul, and even that is extremely rare. But if a soul entering the star's ethereal realm to eventually be born again is a silent promise that death is never the true end, what happens to someone like Calyx, who is now made purely of memory ether? What if the Warrior of Light was successful in destroying the server and expunging every last trace of Calyx from the system? Nothing. Literally nothing. Memories cannot exist on their own, so if the endless form of Calyx was totally defeated, then nothing would have been left behind. No soul, no body, no lingering will, nothing. The entity we call Calyx would have dissipated into complete and utter oblivion. A final death with no hope of anything to survive. In his attempt to grant himself eternal life, Calyx guaranteed that he would eventually face an eternal end. And it's fair to assume that he already knows this. Even if he lacks the courage to say it out loud, the fear of death that he pretends to have forgotten all this time, rearing its ugly head once again, causing even his formless body to convulse with panic. He no longer has a heart, and yet he could feel it racing with fear. Fear of a death that he thought to try and leave behind. The Warrior of Light having gifted Calyx a cold reminder of the fate he chose for himself. A fate he was so eager to force upon others, and how this decision would eventually lead to an all too permanent end should he choose to crawl out from whatever hiding spot he has stolen away into. But the ending of Dawntrail's story reveals that Calyx was never working alone, at least not the whole time, finding himself indebted to Ascian aid on some level. After all, the upheaval of peace and the deconstruction of society upon the Ninth Reflection certainly fits their usual MO. But with the Unsundered defeated and the final days averted, one can only guess what their true intentions are now. We also don't know how long they've been working with him. Perhaps it's only been a recent arrangement, or they might have come to him back when he was still alive, taking advantage of his weakness and fear, and gifting him the knowledge necessary to try to save himself. once again, taking advantage of people at their lowest point is still part of the original Ascian MO. And if this version of Calyx we see is simply an endless projection, what happened to the real one? Just like how the Endless Fiend proves that they are simply copies of the original person, what happened to the true Calyx? Did he perish after finishing his endless project? Was he put into some kind of stasis to suspend his coming end? Or was his body and soul tossed away like useless rags once his endless form had declared itself the evolved state of existence? That is to say, there are still plenty of mysteries surrounding him and his potential use in future plots. However, to believe in his version of evolution is to resign one's memories to a potentially eternal torment. To not only know that they're simply a copy of the original person, but potentially one of many copies, all of which would insist that they are the real deal. And without a soul, without something to anchor them to the cycle of life within the star, the only real fate an Endless can face is a permanent removal. Calyx encouraged and eventually forced a flawed system upon the people of Alexandria that would have resulted in the likely torment of any Endless that woke up to the reality of their existence. Kafkiwa, even as an Endless, knew what she was and what fate awaited all like her, but in her wisdom saw the means to debunk the system and ensure that the Endless within living memory would disappear in the peaceful joys of paradise instead of the eternal limbo Calyx had created.
Mine is an unnatural existence, and I've suffered it only because I had to unmake this twisted mausoleum. But now that brave souls have appeared to whom I might entrust my mission, I may finally embrace the end.
Because so long as the souls powering this twisted system were set free, she understood that new life would eventually blossom within the future. The star's silent promise to all existence that death doesn't have to be the end. It's simply the closing of one book, so that the next one can be opened. But that will be enough ruminations from me for now. Tell me, my friends, what do you think about Calyx and what his survival means for the story of Final Fantasy XIV? Will his fear of death drive him to make even more desperate moves? Will he become yet another tool for Ascian schemes? Or do you have a theory that nobody has considered? I look forward to seeing your thoughts in the comment section below. But, as always, until we meet again, stay safe, my friends. Thank you all for watching to the end. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to subscribe and share with your friends. But before I go, I'd like to acknowledge my biggest contributors. A grand thank you to Amina Voltaria, Nare, and Potato. Links to things like my channel Discord, social media, and connections to my channel artist Caddy can be found down in the description below. Thank you all once again for your viewership, and I hope you have a wonderful day.